After the Cold War ended, the United States pursued a policy that I called liberal hegemony. And the main aim of that strategy was to remake the world in America's image. The policy has failed miserably. If you look at US foreign policy from the end of the Cold War till now, and especially since 2001, it's marked by a whole series of abject failures. And I'll talk about that at great length. And the $64,000 question is why? Why was there all this optimism in the early 1990s? Why did people think we had the wind at our back, and we were going to be able to remake the world in our own image? And today, things don't look good at all. What went wrong? And my argument is that to understand what went wrong, you have to understand the relationship between nationalism and realism and liberalism. And I believe, again, that we have followed what is essentially a liberal foreign policy. This is called liberal hegemony. And that it has been defeated at almost every turn by nationalism and realism. Okay? Now, the way I want to proceed is, first of all, I want to talk about what liberalism is. Then I want to talk about what nationalism is. And when I talk about liberalism and nationalism, I'm not going to say anything about international politics, at least in any meaningful way. I just want to give you a sense for what liberalism is. The United States is a thoroughly liberal country. It is a liberal democracy. Both Republicans, who we sometimes refer to as conservatives, are liberals, and Democrats are liberals. I'm using the term liberal in the John Lockean sense of the term. The United States was born as a liberal democracy. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, these are thoroughly liberal documents. We are a liberal people, okay? But what exactly does that mean? It's very important that you understand it, because you have to understand what liberalism is to understand liberal hegemony and what went wrong. Then it's very important to understand what nationalism is. John's argument is very simple here. Nationalism is the most powerful ideology on the planet. And in a contest between liberalism and nationalism, nationalism wins every time. And what I want to do is explain to you what liberalism is, what nationalism is, and why nationalism defeats liberalism. Then what I want to do is talk about what liberal hegemony is. What does it mean to say that the United States is interested in remaking the world in its own image? So I'll describe that. Then I want to talk about why we pursued liberal hegemony. And of course, I've tipped you off by telling you that the United States is a thoroughly liberal country, but there's more to the story. Then I want to tell you what our track record is. I want to describe our failures in the Middle East, with regard to NATO expansion in Russia, and with regard to engagement in China. Just talk about the evidence that we goofed. Then I want to talk about why liberal hegemony fails. And this, again, is basically a story about nationalism and realism trumping liberalism. And then I want to make the case for restraint, what I think is a wise foreign policy. Okay? So let me start with what is liberalism. There are two bedrock assumptions that underpin liberalism. One is that it's individualistic at its core. And number two is that there are real limits to what we can do with our critical faculties to reach agreement on first principles or questions about the good life. Now, what exactly am I saying? You have to decide when you think about politics whether you think human beings are first and foremost individuals who form social contracts, or you think that human beings are fundamentally social animals who carve out room for their individualism. Okay? This is very, very important to think about. Right? Liberalism is all about individualism. Liberal theorists are known as social contract theorists because they believe that individuals come together and form social contracts. So the focus is on the individual. The assumption underpinning liberalism is not that human beings are social animals from the get-go. That's the first point. The second point is that liberalism assumes that we cannot use our critical faculties. We cannot use reason to come up with truth about first principles. Think about issues like abortion, affirmative action. You cannot get universal agreement on those issues. Right? And I'll talk about this more as we go along, but the roots of liberalism are traced back, in my opinion, to the religious wars in Britain between Catholics and Protestants. And the fact is, you cannot use your critical faculties to determine whether Catholicism is a superior religion to Protestantism, or vice versa, or whether atheism is superior to both of them, or Judaism or Islam is superior to Catholicism and Protestantism. Who knows, right? You just can't reach agreement. There are real limits to what we can do with our critical faculties. Okay, so these are the two bedrock assumptions. One, you focus on the individual, and number two, you accept the fact that you can't reach universal agreement. Now, central question, how should politics be arranged to deal with this potential for violence? And you say to yourself, what does he mean, potential for violence? The fact is that Catholics and Protestants were killing each other in huge numbers, not only in Britain, but all over Europe. People today, Shias and Sunnis, kill each other because they can't agree on whether Shiism or Sunnism is the correct interpretation of Islam. Or communists versus liberals. People can't agree on first principles. And when they can't agree on first principles, if they feel really strongly about them, there is potential for violence. So when you have all these individuals running around who don't agree, they may agree in some cases, but don't universally agree, there's tremendous potential for violence. So liberalism is basically an ideology that's based on conflict. And the question is, how do you solve that conflict? There's a three-part solution, and this should be dear to all of your hearts. The first is you focus on individual rights. Remember the importance of the individual. You know the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are natural rights. Those are inalienable rights. This means that every person on the planet has a particular set of rights, sometimes defined as freedoms. This is to say, you, if you want to be a Protestant, have the right to practice that religion. And if I want to be a Catholic, I have the freedom, I have the right to be a Catholic. The name of the game is to recognize that everybody has these freedoms to choose. This makes perfect sense when you think about Catholics killing Protestants, right? Or Jews killing Muslims, or whatever group you want. Atheists killing believers. Communists killing whatever, right? The point is, you want to focus on the individual and let the individual choose for him or herself what kind of life they want to lead. You want to let them lead as much as possible their version of the good life. And very important, every person on the planet has that right. And let me get ahead of myself here. Just put this seed in your brain. If you focus on individualism and inalienable rights, you go almost automatically from an individualistic ideology to a universalistic ideology, right? Because again, you're focusing on the individual, you're saying every individual has a set of rights, every individual on the planet. That individualistic ideology becomes a universalistic ideology. But we're talking about the individual here. The second is you purvey the norm of tolerance. We talk about tolerance all the time. Universities are really big on tolerance. We're supposed to tolerate opinions that we don't like. You bring in speakers, or you allow speakers to come in who say things that you find reprehensible. Right? Tolerance really matters. But the fact is that tolerance only takes you so far, because you're dealing with people who sometimes are so committed to their beliefs. You know, Somebody who believes that abortion is murder is willing to murder a doctor who practices abortion, right? So you need a state. That's the third element of the equation. You need a state that's effectively a night watchman that makes sure that those people over there who want to live as Protestants don't attack those people who want to live as Catholics, or vice versa. This is the liberal solution. This is what America is all about. Individualism, we talk about it all the time. We talk about rights. Everybody has rights. My kids over the years have always reminded me when I tell them that they have to do X, Y, and Z, that they have rights. And I cannot interfere with their rights, right? It's the way we're educated from the get-go. And of course, we're a remarkably tolerant people as societies go. Not completely, but that's of course why we have a state, right? You gotta have a police force, you gotta have a system of courts, right? So that's what liberalism is all about, right? Liberalism focuses on the individual, right? Pervades the norm of tolerance and accepts the fact that you need a night watchman state. Now, let's talk about nationalism. Different animal. Nationalism is based on the assumption that human beings are social animals. We are born and we are heavily socialized into tribes. We are not born in the state of nature. We are not individuals born and left alone in the woods. We are born into groups. We are very tribal. So you see, in terms of starting assumptions or bedrock assumptions, what underpins nationalism, what underpins liberalism, very, very different. And individualism takes a back seat to group loyalty, right? Somebody around the world kills an American. ISIS kills an American. It's fundamentally different than killing a Saudi or killing a Brit, because you're killing one of us. This is the tribe. Right? You're an American. Americans look out for other Americans. We're social animals from the get-go. And aside from the family, the most important group, remember I said that you're born into and heavily socialized into particular groups. Putting aside the family, the most important group in today's world is the nation. I'll say more about that in a second. What's nationalism? Here's my simple definition. It's a set of political beliefs which holds that a nation, a body of individuals with characteristics that purportedly distinguish them from other groups should have their own state. Think of the word nation state. Nation state. Nation state embodies what nationalism is all about. It says the world is divided up into these tribes called nations, and each one of them wants its own state. If you think about the world today, just look at a map of the world today. It is completely covered with nation states. Nothing but nation states. If you went back to 1450 and you looked at a map of Europe, there isn't even a single state on that map. Over time, with the growth of the state and then the growth of the nation state, you move to a world that is filled with nothing but nation states. Look at the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Jews who believed in Zionism. What is Zionism all about? It's all about having your own Jewish state. Theodor Herzl, who was the father of Zionism, his most famous book is called The Jewish State, Jewish Nation State. What do the Palestinians want? Two-state solution? Palestinians want their own state. Palestinians are a nation, they want their own state. The planet is filled with nations, many of which have their own state, almost all of which want their own state. Nation state. Right? That's what nationalism is all about. Take it a step further. Nations place enormous importance on sovereignty or self-determination, which is why they want their own state. The Palestinians don't want the Israelis deciding what their politics should look like. Palestinians want their own state. Jews want their own state. Germans want their own state. Americans want their own state because they believe in sovereignty. You saw this with Donald Trump. Remember, Donald Trump ran in the campaign on a platform that he referred to as America First. Just think about that. America First. America, particular nation, take care of us first. And he has made it very clear that he does not want anybody interfering in our sovereignty. And he was saying yesterday he doesn't think we should be interfering in the sovereignty of other countries. Right? That's recognition of the power of nationalism. Right? So nations want their own state. And then once you get nation states, they place enormous importance on sovereignty or self-determination. Who are these Russians to be interfering in our elections? The United States is a sovereign country. No country like Russia or any other country for that matter has the right to interfere in our elections. It's the basic argument here. That's what nationalism is really all about. Okay, so you get a feel for the difference between liberalism and nationalism. Liberalism focuses on the individual, and therefore, because it emphasizes individual rights, which everybody has a universalistic dimension. Nationalism is particularistic at the core. Right? Fundamentally different. Okay, so what's liberal hegemony? I've given you the definition of liberalism and the definition of nationalism that I've worked out. Let me talk a little bit about liberal hegemony. It's basically an attempt to remake the world in America's image. And it has three components. The first is spreading liberal democracy all over the globe. And the reason that I put 3 stars up there is it is the most important of the 3. Right? This is the idea that we want to turn every country into a liberal democracy. We want every country on the planet to have the same political system that we do here in the United States. Second goal is we want to integrate more and more countries into the open international economy. This is where we have an emphasis on free trade, lots of economic intercourse, right? Free capital flows, and so forth and so on. You know the whole story. And then third is we want to integrate more and more countries into international institutions. Like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, NATO, think NATO expansion, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Obama administration was building and which President Trump cashiered. Okay, the liberal story places a great emphasis on institutions. It places a great emphasis on an open international economy, and most importantly on spreading democracy. Just to give you a feel for this, Donald Trump ran against liberal hegemony. Right? And liberal hegemony, to be clear, was supported by both Republicans and Democrats. As I like to say, the Republicans especially, but the Democrats also like to make the argument that there's a big difference between the two parties on foreign policy. This is not a serious argument. This is Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Hardly any difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. There's a real difference between Donald Trump and both of them. Remember, Donald Trump ran the table in the Republican primaries by criticizing the Republicans' performance on the foreign policy front for decades and criticizing the Democrats in the general election. Donald Trump said, I'm not interested in spreading liberal democracy across the globe. And in fact, he was quite comfortable making nice with dictators. Second, he was not interested in supporting an open international economy. In fact, he is showing today that he is willing to put tariffs on China, Canada, and our European allies. And as far as international institutions are concerned, he said NATO is obsolete. He was contemptuous of the World Trade Organization, contemptuous of the European Union, does not like the IMF, does not like the World Bank, does not like NAFTA, cashiered the TPP. That's Donald Trump. He ran against this. But Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, they embraced this after the Cold War ended. And by the way, it was the failure of this policy. It's the failure of American policy that helped put Donald Trump in the White House. For those of you who say to yourself, how could this man have ever been elected President of the United States? I'm telling you an important part of the story. Right? It's the failure of the foreign policy elites in this country to produce over the past 30 years. Okay. What are the benefits of liberal hegemony? This is very important. In other words, why did we go down this road? In part is due to the fact that the foreign policy elites in the United States had a story to tell about how this was going to lead to all sorts of wonderful consequences. First of all, if you turn every country on the planet into a liberal democracy, you basically eliminate significant human rights violations. We don't need R2P or any more of these policies that are designed to run around the world protecting human rights, because human rights are no longer threatened, because the world is comprised of nothing but liberal democracies. Second, and maybe even more importantly, liberals tend to believe, and again, I'm using liberals to include Democrats and Republicans, they believe in what's called democratic peace theory. That is that liberal democracies don't fight each other. So if you can create a world of nothing but liberal democracies, they don't fight each other, peace breaks out, and problems like proliferation and terrorism are taken off the table. And it's just a world of peace, love, and dope. Can't get much better than that, right? And then finally, it makes the world safe for liberal democracy. As you all know, inside every liberal democracy, there are going to be elements who don't like liberal democracy. When I was a kid, this was the Communist Party in the United States. Well, if there's no Soviet Union out there that's a communist state that can interact with those communists in the United States, then you don't have to worry about those communists in the United States getting support from abroad. So what we do is we make the whole planet nothing but liberal democracies, and that really ameliorates the problems that any of these liberal democracies have on the home front, because there's no foreign power that can assist them. This is a Woodrow Wilson-like argument made by the likes of George Bush, right? So these are the three great benefits of liberal hegemony. And this is what propelled people to pursue this policy of remaking the world in America's image, which mainly means spreading liberal democracy. Now, why did the US pursue liberal hegemony? First of all, as I said to you folks before, the United States is a profoundly liberal country. It's what makes the United States a wonderful place. You should understand here that I am not arguing that liberalism is a bad thing, period, end of story. I actually think that liberal democracy is the best political system you can possibly have. And I thank my lucky stars that I was born in the United States of America, a liberal democracy, and raised in a liberal democracy. I would want it no other way. My argument is that liberal democracy is the best of all possible political systems that you can have. But as a foreign policy, liberalism is bankrupt. Right? So you understand the argument I'm making here. But this is a fundamentally liberal country. And realists like me, John Schuessler, Jason Castillo, they can tell you this. Realists like me and them have a tough time in America because liberals don't like realists. Right? That's why so many people don't like me. Right? Because I'm a realist on foreign policy grounds, right? Right? So this is a profoundly liberal country. And just to go back to that slide, when you start trying to sell these kinds of arguments in the early 1990s, it's very easy to do. Americans just gravitate to these arguments because it is a liberal country. Second, American nationalism supplied an unhealthy dose of hubris to the equation. This is a very important part of the story. John told you that nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. What I'm telling you also, I didn't say this before, but I'll tell you now, the United States is a very nationalistic country. If you go to the library here, University of Chicago, Harvard, you name it, right? There are whole wings of the library that are filled with books about American liberalism. There is probably one shelf worth of books on American nationalism because we never talk about ourselves as a nationalistic country. We are very nationalistic. Let me just say a few words about this. Madeleine Albright, canonical liberal, right, loves liberal hegemony, is famous for saying this: America is the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further. This is pure, unadulterated nationalism. America as opposed to the other, right? That America is the indispensable, there's the word, nation. Nation, as in nationalism. We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further. Right? We are superior. You all know we're the city on the hill, right? We have the right We have the responsibility and we have the capability to transform countries all around the world into liberal democracies, right? This is nationalism. So what I'm saying to you here, let me just give you another example. American exceptionalism. You surely all believe in American exceptionalism. And if any of you plan to run for political office in the United States, you better say you believe in American exceptionalism. Andrew Cuomo just got himself in trouble for denying that. And Barack Obama flirted with that argument. And he quickly backed off. Well, if you believe in American exceptionalism, you believe in American nationalism. Because exceptionalism is what nationalism is all about. Right? So what you have here is a country that is fueled by both nationalism and liberalism, right? So it is hardly surprising that this country is going to go on a rampage and try to remake the world. And then finally, and this is a very important part of my argument, I believe you can only pursue liberal hegemony in unipolarity. The reason is, if you're in bipolarity or multipolarity, you have other great powers to deal with. And you have to act according to the dictates of realism. Right? Bipolarity means two great powers, multipolarity, three or more. Unipolarity, there's only one great power. Well, if there's only one great power, you don't have to worry about great power politics. This is where the United States was at the end of the Cold War. We were Godzilla. We were incredibly powerful relative to everybody else in the system. Tremendous amounts of power. Charles Krauthammer called this the unipolar moment. So here we are, we're incredibly powerful, and we think that liberal democracy is the wave of the future. We think we have the wind at our back. And we think the idea of spreading liberal democracy, given how powerful we are, is going to be easy. And we don't have to worry about balance of power politics. 1991, the Soviet Union disappears. It was a weakling even before it disappeared. China hasn't risen yet. There's nobody else out there. We don't have to worry about the balance of power, so we are free to pursue liberal hegemony. If you're in a bipolar system or a multipolar system, I'm getting way ahead of myself now. Think rise of China, think resurrection of Russian power. Not much room for liberal hegemony. You're talking about balance of power politics. Pivot to Asia, ... You know the story. But here, if you have unipolarity and the sole pole, that's Uncle Sugar, the sole pole is profoundly liberal, right, and profoundly nationalistic, you're off to the races. And that's what happened starting in the early 1990s. Yeah, liberal hegemony's track record. Just want to talk a little bit about this. These are the failures of American foreign policy. Talk about the Bush Doctrine in the greater Middle East, Afghanistan. You think we're going to turn Afghanistan into a liberal democracy? Just a question when we turn it back over to the Taliban. Longest war in American history. Iraq, total disaster, led to the creation of ISIS. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Iran now has significant influence in Iraq. Syria, we played a key role in unsettling the regime in Syria. That's worked out really well. Libya, we played a key role in toppling Colonel Gaddafi from power. That's really worked out very well. We're deeply involved in the war in Yemen now, which is a human rights catastrophe. The Americans ought to be embarrassed for their disgraceful behavior, supporting this war, supporting the Saudis. You look at our track record in the greater Middle East, failure after failure. And Donald Trump, to his credit, pointed this out in the campaign. And the American people fully understand this. The elites in this country don't, because they're deeply invested in these wars. But dismal track record. The Ukraine crisis and U.S.-Russia relations, of course, inside the elite, we blame the Russians. The Americans never blame themselves for anything. But actually what happened here is that the United States decided when the Cold War ended that we would take NATO and we would take the EU and we would march them eastward right up to the border of Russia. And what we would do is we would help solidify the democracies that had emerged in Eastern Europe after the Cold War. We would get the countries in Eastern Europe embedded in international institutions like NATO and the EU. We would get them hooked on capitalism, and we would make sure they were liberal democracies. By the way, those countries that weren't liberal democracies, we would foment revolutions. Remember the Orange Revolution in Ukraine? The Rose Revolution in Georgia? Right? It's all part of a piece. It's all part of this story. Right? Realists like me, George Kennan, we all said, are you crazy? You think you could take a military alliance that was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and march it right up to the Russians' border, and they're just going to sit there and take it? And of course, the Russians screamed bloody murder about NATO expansion from 1995 forward. We didn't listen, right? But it eventually blew up in our face. Georgia, 2008, Ukraine, 2014. We are principally responsible for creating the crisis that led to Russia recapturing Crimea, or capturing Crimea, depending on your view, and for the war in Ukraine today. The Russians have basically said, you're not going to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on our border. Not going to happen. We'll wreck it before we let that happen. And they said the same thing about Georgia. From an American point of view, this makes eminently good sense. You've all heard of the Monroe Doctrine, right? You know what the Monroe Doctrine says? No distant great power from Europe or East Asia is allowed to come into the Western Hemisphere with military force and form an alliance with any country in this region. That's the Monroe Doctrine. I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. We went ballistic when we found out the Soviets had put missiles in Cuba. And then later they were talking about building a naval base at Cienfuegos. Who do these people think they are? Don't they understand that this is the Western Hemisphere? They are not allowed to move military forces into this region. We still have sanctions on Cuba. God knows how many years since 1959 this has been going on. Because the Cubans had the audacity to form a military alliance with a distant great power. Well, as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we can have a Monroe Doctrine, are you shocked that they had a Monroe Doctrine, or they have a Monroe Doctrine? You're shocked that the Russians don't like the idea of us marching NATO right up to their border? You shouldn't be. You shouldn't be. Great powers, I can tell you from studying a lot of military history, are remarkably sensitive about their borders. And the idea that an enemy is going to creep right up to their borders and they're just going to stand there and say, oh, that's okay. We live in a world of peace, love, and dope. That's not the way international politics works. That's realism 101, slamming liberal hegemony. It's also all about nationalism, right? Because the United States is interested in interfering in the politics of both Russia and China. And this brings us to engagement with China. Our goal from the beginning has been to turn China into a liberal democracy. That involves interfering with their politics. Do you think they were happy about that? No, they weren't. Let's go back to the goose and the gander. You've been watching all of these Americans screaming bloody murder about the fact the Russians are interfering in our election. Well, don't you think the Chinese and the Russians are going to scream bloody murder when we try and interfere in their politics? They are. Surprise of surprises. But of course, liberals, and here again I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats, view us as a benign hegemon. We're a benign hegemon. We only have good intentions, and we just want to make the world look like us. And of course, once that happens, we all live happily ever after. Didn't work out that way. Just look at that giant disaster zone called the Middle East. Look at the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who've died. We have a lot of blood on our hands. U.S.-Russian relations, we bear the principal responsibility for the deterioration of those relations. And with regard to engagement, it's been a failure. Principal architects like Kurt Campbell now admit that's true. We failed. Right? The policy has been an abject failure. So the question is, why did it fail? I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but power of nationalism, right? I was one of the leading opponents, there weren't many, in the sort of foreign policy establishment. I was one of the leading opponents of the Iraq War. I think it was because I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War. And when I heard that these people were thinking about invading Iraq, I said, have they lost their mind, right? There's no question the United States military is an incredibly formidable fighting force, and we can topple regimes almost anywhere in the world. Maybe China and Russia left out. We can go into Iran, go into Iraq, go into Syria. You can topple regimes. But the problem is, what do you do once you own the place, right? What do you do? You're greeted as a liberator the first day, week, maybe even the first month, right? All sorts of people were glad we got rid of Saddam Hussein. But then we got to stay to do social engineering. And this is a prescription for big trouble. Remember what I told you about sovereignty? Remember what I told you about self-determination? You think the Iraqis wanted us telling them what color toilet paper they could use? I don't think they liked it at all. And we had resistance, serious resistance. You want to wreck Russia? Tell them to invade Ukraine. That'll be pretty. Let them go into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Let them reestablish the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. You think that'll make them more powerful? They'll be up to their eyeballs in alligators. I remember in 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Virtually everybody in the national community, security community was aghast. Oh my God, the Soviets are on the march. This is the end of the world. I said, you got it all wrong. They just jumped into a giant tar pit. When you're involved in an arms race with a country like the Soviet Union, what you want them to do is go into Afghanistan. Just like you want us to go into Vietnam. You want to do that one again? Almost tore this country apart. Almost wrecked our military. Whew. So I told the Chinese when I first started going there in the early 2000s, what you ought to tell the Americans is you're counting on them to win the war on terror. Tell them they got to stay in Afghanistan and Iraq until they win the war. They'll be there forever, grinding up their military, wrecking their economy. You know what the lesson here is? Stay out of those places unless you absolutely have to go in. But we had exactly the opposite worldview because we had a foreign policy that's based on liberalism. Right? We thought we had a right, a responsibility, and the capability to do all this social engineering. Power of nationalism. You never want to underestimate it. And you want to understand that as Americans, you are very nationalistic, and you ain't special. Everybody else on the planet is very nationalistic. And nationalism is all about self-determination and sovereignty. And if you don't like people interfering in your politics, don't be surprised if they don't like you interfering in their politics. Talk about the power of realism. Again, when you're dealing with China and you're dealing with Russia, you're dealing with very powerful countries. And you start moving military alliances, you start moving military forces up to their borders, you get in their face, you're asking for serious trouble. Right? Just talk to the Chinese sometime about how they think about those American naval and air forces right off their coast. It really bothers them. They don't like it at all. I don't blame them. Right? As an American, I'm glad we're there. I want to contain the Chinese. Let me be very clear about that. I'm a realist. I don't want to cut the Chinese any slack. But I understand why they get upset. But again, liberal hegemony doesn't buy that line of argument. Now, I want to talk about overselling individual rights and illiberal liberalism. Just very quickly on overselling individual rights. The fact is that we make a really big deal about the importance of rights here in the United States. But if you look around the world, most people don't really think that individual rights matter that much. In a thoroughly liberal country like the United States, you can sell that kind of argument up to a point, but it's very hard to do abroad, especially in countries where people prize security. If you go to Russia today and you talk to people about liberal democracy and rights, they will tell you, almost all of them, we tried that in the 1990s, and Russia was turned into the Wild West. We're much happier with Putin and the political system that we have. Soft authoritarianism. It's much more suited for us. And we don't care that much about rights. We have some rights, we understand their limits, but we don't want your political system. We've been there, we tried that, it didn't work. Right? So what I'm saying to you is in a lot of countries, when you invade them and you think you can do social engineering, all for the purpose of turning them into liberal democracies, what you discover in almost all those cases is that being turned into a liberal democracy where individual rights are prized is not that important. It's not to say it's unimportant, but people are just not craving for individual rights. And in many cases, they're just craving for stability. If you're an Iraqi and it's 2003, and Uncle Sugar pays you a visit. He topples the regime, right? And then chaos breaks out. Over the next couple years, you're not going to be worried too much about creating a liberal democracy. You're not going to be worried too much about individual rights. You're just going to be worried about what you can do to stabilize the country so that you and your family don't get killed, right? So you just want to understand that we tend to oversell individual rights. And when you marry that with the power of nationalism and the power of realism, you get into real trouble. My final point has to do with illiberal liberalism. Remember what I told you about liberalism to begin with. I told you that liberalism was predicated on the assumption that you could not reach universal agreement on first principles. Remember I told you that. And therefore you develop sort of a live and let live political order. That's what liberalism is. It's a modus vivendi form of politics. You let people decide for themselves. If he wants to be a Protestant, I want to be a Catholic. He wants to be a Jew, I want to be a Muslim. You let people do what they want, okay? Because you can't reach universal agreement. If you think about it, liberal hegemony is based on intolerance. It says everybody has to be a liberal democracy. My view is if you have soft authoritarianism in Russia, so what? That's their choice. Why can't they have a soft authoritarian system? Why do we have to say everybody has to look like us? Isn't this antithetical to the basic liberal enterprise? I think the answer is yes. Case for restraint, very quickly. If I'm running foreign policy, and you can rest assured that will never happen, but if I was running American foreign policy from the early 90s forward, I would have pursued a policy of restraint. I would have abandoned liberal hegemony, which mainly means abandoning the policy of spreading democracy around the world. Okay, I think that was the key mistake that we made. Right? We thought that liberal democracy was going to take root everywhere. For those of you young people who haven't read Frank Fukuyama or Francis Fukuyama's famous article, The End of History, you really should read it. The two most important articles that were written when the Cold War ended were Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and Charles Krauthammer's The Unipolar Moment. And basically what Frank Fukuyama said is that we spent the first half of the 20th century defeating fascism. We spent the second half defeating communism. And now that we had won those two battles, all that was really left standing was liberal democracy. And the world was slowly but steadily going to evolve into a system of liberal democracies. And Frank says at the very end of the piece that the biggest problem that we're going to face in the future is probably boredom. Boredom. Why boredom? Because once you have a world that's populated by all liberal democracies, you get peace. And Krauthammer wrote this piece called The Unipolar Moment that he said this is a unique moment in world history, and the United States is by far the most powerful state on the planet. We have this tremendous military, and we ought to use it to reshape the world in our own interest. You marry Krauthammer's argument with Fukuyama's argument. Fukuyama says we've got the wind at our back. Krauthammer says we have this big stick that we can use to facilitate the process, and you're off to the races, right? And this, of course, is exactly what happens. But I would have abandoned that. And I would have concentrated instead on maintaining a favorable global balance of power, which mainly means containing the rise of China, right? As you would expect from a realist like me, what I really care about is not what kind of political system a state has. I just care how much power it has. And my principal goal as an American is to make sure we are the most powerful state on the planet. And as many of you know, in my lexicon, that means to make sure we are a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. We want to be a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere and make sure that there is no hegemon in Europe or in East Asia or in the Gulf. Right? So I believe in primacy. That's my definition of primacy, to be the most powerful state in the system. But I'm not interested, to go back to my first point, in spreading liberal democracy. Again, I think liberal democracy is a wonderful thing. If every state in the world was a liberal democracy, I think that would be good for the people who live in those countries. But my view is, because I believe in sovereignty, it's up to them to decide what they want. Final point I want to make to you here on this slide is liberalism abroad leads to illiberalism at home. This is what the founding fathers understood. If you're in a permanent state of war, right, it's going to have consequences for liberalism at home, because you're going to create a national security state. And you're going to have a state that spies on people and does all sorts of other things. So I think from a point of view of civil liberties, this foreign policy is bankrupt. Final point, the end of liberal hegemony. You remember what John said to you very early in the talk? I said that you could only have liberal hegemony in unipolarity, because in unipolarity, the sole pole, which is the United States, does not have to worry about great power politics, because by definition, you can't have great power politics when there's only one great power. Well, we are now transitioning out of unipolarity into multipolarity. This is very clearly reflected in a document on the country's national security strategy that the White House issued in December of 2017, and then the Pentagon in January of 2018 issued a similar document on our national security strategy. And both these documents make it clear that multipolarity is here, that unipolarity is over with, and great power politics is what we're going to be mainly concerned with in the future. And that has to do with, one, the rise of China, which I think for all of you young people in the audience will be the most important issue of your lifetime. And then the second issue is the resurrection of Russian power after Putin came to office in 2000. Russia is a declining great power. You don't want to overestimate Russian power, right? China is the real threat to the United States here. But nevertheless, the Russians are back, and the Russians have thousands of nuclear weapons, and they can cause us a lot of trouble, and we are at loggerheads with them over the Ukraine crisis. So we want to pay them serious attention. But what I'm saying to you here is that I think with the coming of multipolarity, liberal hegemony will go away. Now, if I'm wrong and we remain in a unipolar world because the Chinese rise doesn't continue and Russia begins to fall apart again, and we are once again the unipole, then we're back to arguing against liberal hegemony and making the case for restraint. But I don't think that people like me are going to have to make the case for restraint in the future, in large part because of the rise of China. I would say, and this is my concluding point, that I have very mixed emotions about that. On one hand, I welcome the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power because it means that liberal hegemony is going away. But on the other hand, what it means is that the United States is now facing a potential peer competitor. And I think all things considered, I'd rather have liberal hegemony as a problem to deal with rather than have China and Russia as twin problems to deal with. Thank you. Sure.